I realized my relationship was slowly destroying me the day I understood that the man I loved could hear my pain without truly remembering it afterward. That realization did not come during a fight or a dramatic moment. It arrived quietly one evening while I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, listening to him talk casually about inviting friends over that weekend. My stomach tightened immediately. A few months earlier, I had sat beside him on our bed and finally admitted how severe my social anxiety had become. I remember how difficult it was to say out loud. My throat felt tight the entire conversation. I explained how exhausted I felt after social gatherings, how my body physically reacted before events, how sometimes I sat in bathrooms during parties just trying to calm my breathing before returning to the room pretending I was fine. He listened carefully that night. He held my hand. He kissed my forehead and told me we would figure it out together. But standing there at the sink, hearing him enthusiastically describe plans for a crowded evening in our apartment, I realized something painful. He had listened to me emotionally in the moment, but he had not absorbed me. There is a very lonely kind of pain that comes from being emotionally visible for a few minutes and emotionally forgotten afterward. I think that was the beginning of my grief, not the end of the relationship. The grief, because after that moment, I started noticing how often it happened. I would tell him something vulnerable, something that cost me emotional energy to reveal, and he would respond kindly in the moment. He was never cruel. That almost made it harder. If he had been cold or dismissive, maybe I could have understood the problem more clearly. Instead, he was gentle, present, well-intentioned, and somehow still emotionally absent in the ways that mattered most to me. A year before that conversation, I told him I thought I might be depressed, not sad, not overwhelmed. Depressed in the heavy, frightening way where life begins losing color quietly and you start wondering if everyone else is secretly pretending to be alive too. I remember crying while saying it because I had spent most of my life trying to appear emotionally functional. Admitting it felt humiliating somehow. He hugged me immediately. He told me he loved me. He stayed beside me the entire evening. But then something happened that I could never fully explain to him afterward without sounding ungrateful. He never brought it up again. Not once. Days passed. Then weeks. He never asked if I was feeling better. Never checked whether I had called a therapist. Never asked what my depression felt like. Never seemed curious about the emotional reality I had trusted him enough to reveal. At first I told myself he simply did not know what to do. Then I told myself maybe I expected too much. Then eventually I stopped mentioning my emotional state at all because there is something deeply painful about repeatedly opening your inner world to someone who treats every confession like an isolated event instead of part of a larger emotional picture. That was the problem I could never fully explain to anyone else. He listened to moments. I needed someone who understood patterns. I am a deeply emotional person. Not dramatic, not unstable, just deeply aware. I notice emotional shifts quickly. I remember tiny details people reveal about themselves. I think constantly about emotional meaning, emotional memory, emotional connection. When someone I love tells me they are struggling, I carry it with me afterward. I check in days later. I connect it to other things they have said before. I build an understanding of their emotional landscape over time. With him, I always felt like I was emotionally starting from the beginning every single conversation. And yet he loved me. That is what made everything so confusing. If someone neglects you while obviously not caring, the pain is cleaner somehow. Easier to define. But what happens when someone genuinely loves you and still cannot meet you emotionally? That question exhausted me for years. When we first met, I admired his softness. He had a calm presence that made me feel safe after years of emotionally chaotic relationships. He was patient, stable, never manipulative, never explosive. But he was also emotionally disconnected from himself in ways I did not recognize at first. He had difficulty naming his feelings, difficulty understanding conflict, difficulty reflecting inward. Whenever something hurt him, his instinct was to suppress it until it disappeared or transformed into quiet withdrawal. I spent years helping him open emotionally, and he did grow. That is important for me to say honestly. He tried. He truly tried. I taught him how to talk through conflict instead of avoiding it. I helped him identify emotional triggers from childhood. I encouraged therapy. I sat with him through difficult family realizations and painful memories he had buried for years. Watching him grow emotionally became one of the deepest expressions of love I had ever experienced. But eventually, I started noticing something heartbreaking. I was teaching him emotional awareness while slowly starving emotionally myself. Every conversation centered around helping him process his feelings, his fears, his wounds, his confusion. Mine became secondary. Not intentionally, just naturally. And that is how emotional imbalance often develops. Quietly, gradually, through patterns so subtle you almost feel guilty for noticing them. I remember one night that still hurts to think about. I had spent the entire week emotionally overwhelmed. Work stress, family problems, panic attacks returning after months of improvement. I felt fragile in a way I had not felt in years. That evening he came home upset after an argument with a friend. I immediately shifted into emotional caretaking mode without even thinking. I sat beside him for hours asking questions, comforting him, helping him process the situation from every angle. By the end of the night he looked calmer. Then he smiled weakly and thanked me for always understanding him. I remember lying awake later staring at the ceiling with tears sliding silently into my hair because I realized something devastating. He had spent hours speaking about his emotional pain without noticing mine at all. Not because he was selfish. Because emotional attention simply did not occur naturally to him the way it did to me. That realization changed the entire relationship for me. After that, I started observing us differently. I noticed how he rarely followed up on anything vulnerable I shared, how he forgot emotional details quickly, how conversations about my inner world usually ended once the immediate moment passed, how I always carried the emotional continuity of the relationship while he participated emotionally only in present tense moments. I became exhausted in ways I could not explain publicly because from the outside our relationship looked healthy. He was loyal, kind, reliable. He helped around the house. He remembered birthdays. He hugged me constantly. He wanted us to work. But emotional loneliness inside a relationship is invisible to everyone except the person living inside it. And it is one of the most isolating experiences I have ever known. I started doubting myself constantly. Maybe I was too emotionally demanding. Maybe I expected unrealistic depth. Maybe years of introspection had made me emotionally impossible to satisfy. I spent months researching attachment styles, emotional intelligence, trauma responses, relationship psychology. I kept hoping I would discover some explanation that made the loneliness easier to fix. Instead, I discovered something more painful. Sometimes two good people are emotionally incompatible in ways love alone cannot repair. That truth broke my heart slowly, because he never stopped trying. If I cried, he held me. If I asked for reassurance, he gave it. If I explained what I needed, he listened carefully. But emotional depth cannot survive entirely through instructions. I did not want to constantly explain how to emotionally care for me while already emotionally exhausted. I wanted to be known intuitively sometimes, remembered, emotionally tracked. I wanted someone who noticed changes in my energy before I verbalized them. Someone who remembered my fears weeks later. Someone who carried my emotional world with genuine curiosity instead of temporary attention. And the cruelest part was that he believed he was giving me everything he could. I think that is why I stayed so long. Because leaving someone who is genuinely trying feels unbearable. Especially when you know they already carry wounds about not being enough. Near the end of our relationship, I became quieter. Not intentionally. I was simply tired. Tired of translating my emotional needs into understandable instructions. Tired of explaining why listening once was not the same as emotionally holding something long term. Tired of feeling emotionally invisible beside someone who loved me sincerely. One night he asked me if I was okay because I had become distant recently. I remember almost laughing when he said recently. I wanted to ask him how long he thought emotional loneliness takes to develop. I wanted to ask him how many nights I had quietly cried beside him while he slept peacefully. I wanted to ask why he never noticed my emotional withdrawal while I had spent years noticing every subtle shift inside him. But I said none of that. I only told him I was tired. He nodded sympathetically and kissed my shoulder. Then he fell asleep 10 minutes later while I lay awake feeling more alone than I had ever felt living by myself. That was the strangest part of the relationship. I had been lonelier beside him than I ever was alone. Eventually we separated gently. No betrayal. No screaming. No dramatic collapse. Just two people grieving something they could not fix. I think he was shocked by how emotionally devastated I became at the end because from his perspective he had truly tried to love me well. And he had. Just not in the language my heart naturally understood. Sometimes I still think about him with enormous tenderness. I do not hate him. I actually believe he was one of the kindest people I have ever known. But kindness and emotional attunement are not always the same thing. Love and emotional depth are not automatically the same thing either. That realization changed how I understand relationships entirely. Now I believe emotional compatibility is not simply about communication or affection. It is about whether someone naturally holds emotional continuity with you. Whether they stay emotionally connected to the things you reveal after the moment itself passes. Some people hear your pain. Others emotionally carry it. And once you experience the difference, it becomes impossible to ignore. I still struggle sometimes with the guilt of leaving someone who genuinely wanted to improve. There are nights when I wonder if I abandoned him unfairly, if I should have accepted his limitations more gracefully. But then I remember how quietly I disappeared inside that relationship. How I stopped sharing parts of myself because repeating emotional truths that nobody remembers eventually becomes humiliating. How I started feeling emotionally safer alone than emotionally unseen beside someone else. And I understand now that loneliness inside love can slowly convince you that your emotional needs are excessive when they are actually just incompatible with the person beside you. I do not think either of us was wrong. I think we were simply reaching for each other from different emotional depths and hoping love alone could bridge the distance. Sometimes it can, sometimes it cannot. And accepting that may be one of the saddest forms of maturity I have ever experienced.